Hello, today is December 5th, 1994, and my name is Dan Cruz, and I am a volunteer with the Illinois Historical Society, which is cooperating with a statewide effort to collect oral histories from Illinois citizens that participated in the events surrounding World War II. We are in the home of Guy Tingley, who lives at, what's your address, Guy?
Rural Route 4, Box 40, Rural Route 1, Box 44, Marshall.
Guy served in a branch of the United States Armed Forces during World War II, and we are interviewing him about his experiences in that war. Guy, would you please start by introducing yourself to me, please?
My name is Guy Tingley.
And give me your place and date of birth.
Clark County, June 6, 22.
We would also like to have the names of each of your parents.
Harry and Alice Tingley.
And do you have any brothers or sisters?
I have 3 brothers and 2 sisters.
And their names?
Jane's my oldest sister, and I have 3 brothers, Bill, Gene, and Carl, and a younger sister, Mary Ellen.
Are there any details about your parents or your family that you wouldn't mind giving me at this time?
Well, I'm not sure what kind of details you want.
What was your father?
Raised on a farm.
Your dad was a farmer?
Yeah, he was a farmer. And then for several years he had a thrash machine. I had a thrashing route down south of us a ways, and then went up around Redmond every year and had a thrashing run.
It's a pretty far distance up the Redmond, wasn't it?
Well, it was for a steam engine.
What was life like for you before the war, specifically during 1941?
Well, in 41 I was on construction work.
What kind of work did you do in construction? Were you just labor?
Labor, yes.
What types of jobs did you do, and where did you do this at?
Well, I worked over south of Terre Haute on the storage disposal for 4 or 5 months, I think it was, just before we went in. And then I said construction work, but I was up in Michigan for about 6 months and worked in a factory that made plane wings.
Oh, really? This is before the war?
Yes.
Do you remember what kind of planes you worked on by any chance?
No, I didn't even know at the time, I don't think.
Is that right? Guy, I might have messed up in one of my questions, but what's the date of your birth?
June the 6th, 22.
Okay, June the 6th, 1922. What thoughts did you have about the war before the United States became directly involved in the conflict?
Well, that's been a long time ago to remember my thoughts then, but I don't really remember. I think we thought for quite a while we'd be into it, and they was beginning to build up the forces some, and had set up a draft. Well, I think that a good many of us began to think there was a possibility of being in service.
Now, what year did you graduate high school?
40.
1940. Were there very many people that you attended school with that either joined the military pretty quick when they got out, or I know that this was just about 2 years before Pearl Harbor, so were there any people that went into the military service upon leaving high school in 1940?
I don't really remember if there was. They could have been, but not very many anyway.
Well, as you are aware, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Did you hear the announcement about the attack? And if so, what were you doing, and where were you at when you heard the attack?
Well, I kind of believe it was at church when we got the word.
And
it was on a Sunday morning, and I kind of believe it was at church when somebody come and told us.
What was your reaction to that? Do you remember? Were you surprised or
Well,
shocked?
yes, I was kind of surprised, because you didn't think about a country like Japan jumping on the United States.
Was there any? Were you with other young men? And if you were, was there any kind of feeling of fear or dread, or like unsure about when you heard about the attack?
No, I think a lot of people thought it wouldn't last very long.
You mean the war?
Yeah.
The war. Had you formed any prior opinion at this time, or developed any feeling about what had been taking place either in Europe or Asia?
Well, of course, at the time, the country was doing a good deal on supplies and so on, helping the other countries into Europe against Germany.
Right.
And I think there were a lot of people beginning to think we'd be in it over there.
You know, this community in which you live, there were a number of those who were either descendants from, had German ancestry. Were there any thoughts about that maybe there were people that had similar or close ties to those over in Europe?
I don't remember any, because most of the people here, I don't think any of them had come directly from Germany. They might have been their grandparents or something.
Several generations.
Yeah.
Let's see, do you recall reading newspaper accounts of any of the German aggression or the Chinese or Japanese aggression in Europe or in Asia?
Yeah. And there was always news on every evening. I'd always listen to.
Well, do you remember what kind of stories they talked about, and maybe did you have any knowledge of like Hitler's speeches or ideas or any of the actions that were taking place over in Europe?
Yeah, we heard and read different parts of them. Or there was a news commentator that used to give a lot of them.
Mm-hmm. Were the newspapers in Marshall at that time, and did you get Terre Haute newspapers at that time? Or
We always took a Terre Haute newspaper.
were they full of accounts of what was developing through the world?
Yeah. There was always something in them.
Well, what events led to your entry into military service? Were you already in the service, drafted, or did you volunteer?
No, I was drafted.
And what was the date in which you were drafted?
Well, it was in November of '42. I don't remember the exact day.
Where and when were you inducted?
Well, I think I went through Camp Grant Induction Center.
No, where's Camp Grant?
North Central Illinois.
Okay, that's kind of the northwestern part. That's not Springfield, is it? Grant?
No.
Okay. Do you have any special memories?
I think they call it Rantoul now.
Oh, is that right up there where Chanute Air Force Base is?
Yeah.
Do you have any special memories of the day in which you were inducted into the service? Anything that stands out in your mind?
Well, yeah, of course they give us several tests and some interviews. The fellow told me I made a good grades on the test. Said you can probably get in about any branch of service you'd like to be in. The next day they shipped me out to the infantry.
Some choice, huh?
Yeah.
How old were you at this time? Do you remember?
20.
20. When you went up to get inducted, were there any other Clark County people that went along at the same time?
Yeah, there were several.
What happened after you were inducted into the military?
Well, they sent us to Camp Grant, Louisiana, or Camp Claiborne, Louisiana.
And is this where you took your military training?
Yeah, I was in the infantry for a year there.
Okay. Well, tell me a little bit about the training, some of the things that you did.
Well, the first 6 weeks you got a lot of calisthenics and basics with a gun and just general military courtesy and marching, how to teach you how to march formations. Mostly stuff like that. We didn't, first 3 months or 6 weeks, I'm not sure which, we wasn't out in the field very much.
Were you trained for anything, any specific duty at your basic training, or just as a simple
Well, I was in the mortar section, and it was a new outfit. I was soon made acting corporal of the squad. And so that's about all I remember right at the first, you know.
Well, what did you think of your training at this time?
Well, they didn't aim for you to loaf much.
Is that right? Well, kind of give me a rundown of the typical things that you would do and how they were on you, or what they wanted to make sure that you were prepared to do. Now, you mentioned a lot of infantry tactics. Was it pretty continuous training the entire time, or were?
Yeah, we had a full day and a lot of time night problems or classes or something like that to keep you busy. And then it kind of went in phases after the first one. Well, then we got a second phase where you just started going out in the field more all the time.
What did you was it extended times out in the field? Like, did you camp out there, or was it just basically marching out there and coming back?
Well, the biggest part of the time we came back. A lot of times we'd stay out there one night or maybe 2 nights. Run platoon or company problems. A lot of squad problems, setting up the gun and moving up, and learning to take hand signals.
So a mortar crew, was were you using live ammunition and all this out there, or was it?
No. That was just a special practice of just running the problems. You never used live ammunition.
Tell me about any other kind of training camps that you attended at this time.
Well, in infantry?
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't know. Well, we also got training on the firing range. Learned to shoot the M1 and 45. And then later on we would train some with the mortar, with live ammunition.
Do you remember how many men were with you at the time that you went through your training?
There were close to 200 in the company. 3 rifle platoons and a weapons platoon. Each had 3 machine gun squads and 3 mortar squads in the weapons platoon. I believe it was 5 men to the squad.
So there are a number of these teams. Now, you, after you say you spent 1 year in the infantry, what happened after that year?
Well, I wrote on the exam and got in cadet training.
In cadet training?
Yes.
And what did this cadet training lead to?
Well, it led to promotion as a navigator.
In the Army Air Corps?
Yes, on B-24s.
Well, tell me about that, to your I guess, I don't know if the correct term is transferred. Would it be transferred to this unit?
Well, you had about, I remember, about 3 months. They called it CTD, College Training Detachment. And about 2 or 3 months pre-flight. Then you went to navigation school. I believe it was 4 months navigation school, where you specialized in navigation training.
How did you like that compared to infantry training?
Well, a lot better. You felt like you were learning a little something. It would help you.
Oh, did you?
I'd say a lot of it was equal, or a good part of it equal to college work. And they, I don't know if it was really so hard, but they throwed enough at you, and they didn't aim to repeat it. But get it the first time over, you's out of luck.
Is that right?
And they aimed to keep you under a good deal of stress to see how much you could take.
What were your trainers like, or your teachers? Were they Were they pilots and navigation people or Army airport people?
When I got an advanced, we done a good deal of flying training missions. Your instructors were navigators, and a lot of, a good many of the pilots were, well, some of them had been overseas and come back and was on stateside duty, and then some of them were just more or less getting in time before they went over.
Yeah. How did you, when you went to the infantry training, down to Louisiana from Illinois, how did you go by train?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, tell me this. Tell me about the first experience, your first experience flying as a young cadet.
Well, you got 10 hours training in I believe it was CTD. They were either pre-flight in a Cub. That was before you was classified as a navigator, bombardier, or pilot. And then,
So there was someone else flying the Cub that you were
Yes.
going up with?
yeah, you had an instructor pilot with you. You handled the controls.
What was that like? Was that fearful for you? Was that the first time you had ever flown?
Yeah, I think it was.
Is that right?
Oh, I enjoyed it.
Did you?
And it was just like flying lessons. And the instructor I had, he said I was ready to solo when we quit, but they didn't let anybody solo.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
So you came that close to flying?
They give you
planes?
10 hours training, but they never let anyone solo. But he said that I was ready for it if they would let us.
Huh. Your job at the Army Air Corps, you said it was navigation.
Yes.
Tell me about your training there and what they teach you to do and how was that achieved?
Well, of course, they taught you to figure out your flight pattern and lay out the course you wanted to fly and figure your wind direction and speed on how much that affected you. And there's different kinds of navigation. There's pilotage, that's where you watch on the ground, see where you're going. Dead reckoning is keeping up with your airspeed and direction of flight, and on how long and the time you travel. And then we got into celestial quite a bit. We used a sextant to shoot the different stars with and figure that out.
Sounds like that would take a lot of math background.
It's quite a bit, yes.
Is that right?
And some of you had to have certain tables to work with.
Did you enjoy that? Did it kind of come easy for you, or?
Well, yeah, I don't know if I ever got real good at it. I don't know that we used it enough and really get good at it, but then that was something, the more practice you done, the better off you got.
Now, when you were assigned to a plane or to a crew, did this group stay together the entire time, or did you switch? And another question I forgot to ask you, but let's back up a second. Where did this training take place at?
Well, I got my CTD at Shreveport, Louisiana, my pre-flight to San Antonio, Texas. I forget what was in between there. I went to gunnery school down to Harlingen, Texas. Then I took my advanced navigation training at Hondo, Texas. Texas was the only place they ever wanted me to be, I think.
Now, what were the dates that you were there in Texas doing your training?
Well, let's see, 42. It was the early part of 43 I got in cadets. And let's see, I think it was in November 44 that I graduated. If I remember right.
So, you say,
I was a year and a half or better or something like that going through cadet training.
is that right? Well, I guess the other question I was going to say is, the crew in which you were with, were you assigned to one crew? Did you all stick together, or did they break you up and move you around quite a bit?
Once we got assigned to a crew, when I was assigned to a crew, was out of Marshfield, California, in B-24s. We trained as a crew and we stayed together then. Our crew did. We was took about 3 months overseas training, and
What did overseas training consist of?
flying a lot of different missions. Got mostly a lot of practice dropping bombs out on there in the desert on the bombing range. Some gunnery, some navigation missions, and different things like that. We done quite a bit of practice bombing.
What did you think of the B-24?
And then also the pilots would learn to fly formation at times. We'd have formation flights. Well, for that time, it was a good plane.
How many were in your crew?
10.
10. That you mentioned formation. When I look at pictures of that, different pictures of planes flying in formation, I always kind of think that looks like it had to be difficult to get that many planes up at one time and then get in that position. And I don't know how close those planes flew together, but sometimes it looked like they were awful close, and it would be somewhat frightening.
What time for you floating out to see the rivets on your next plane?
That's pretty close in the sky. Tell me about the guys that were assigned to fly the plane, your pilot. It seems to be, if you are a member of a crew on a plane, that you have to be a pretty good team. You have to work real well together.
I think we worked real good together. Our crew had a good record. Our first pilot was Bill Buck. He's from up here at Odell, Illinois. And he didn't excite Bill much. He took things calm, but he was good. And the co-pilot was from Virginia. And he wasn't near as good. He wasn't near as big a man as Bill, but they were both good pilots. They took turns about on takeoff and landing, so they both practiced. And there were some of them crews, they never let the co-pilot do either one.
Is that right?
Yeah. And we probably had the best crew chief in the squadron.
What was his name?
Charlie Neff. He was from Missouri. Our radio operator was the youngest man on the crew. He was 18. He was from Texas. And then I had 4 gunners. One from Texas, one from Georgia, one from New York, and one from Ohio. Howard Maxwell from Georgia, Walt Finley from Texas, Marty Kirstine was the nose gunner from New York, and Charlie Cutlip was the armor man and the gunner. He was from Ohio.
So you came from all over for the crew on that one plane?
Yeah, pretty well mixed up.
Do you know how you were brought together? Was it just that, just kind of assigned together, or do you know, were you training with any of these guys before you came together?
Never seen them before.
So you just kind of all arrived there in California together?
Yes.
Huh. Were there any other training camps that you attended while you were in the service?
No.
While you were doing your training, did you receive any leaves or passes?
Yeah, I was home. First time I was gone for a year before I got 10-day furlough. And I think about 9 months the second time. And when I graduated from navigation school, I believe we had about a 10-day delay en route.
Did you come home after when you had that
Yes.
kind of a leave? On leaves when you had 2 or 3 days, what kind of things did you do?
Never had a 3-day leave all the time I was in service.
Is that right? Just those extended leaves then?
Yeah. There was possibly an overnight, but I never had any 3 days.
Once again, the name of the place where you were stationed in California?
Marchfield, right close to Riverside.
Okay, no, that's in Southern California.
That's about 50 miles east of LA.
Okay. Were there any other places you were stationed out on the West Coast?
No.
Did you have very much association with civilians while you were in California?
Oh, in town, you've seen several of them, yeah. Got acquainted with a few nice looking women.
I think that's sometimes that's important. When you were doing your training on the B-24, did you ever have a sense whether you were training for combat in Europe or in the Pacific?
Well, at that time, everything was being concentrated on Europe. And the B-29 was out at that time, and they went to the Pacific because they had a lot longer range to them than what the B-24s did.
Did you ever have any opportunity to either fly in a B-29 or a B-17, or were you primarily just with the B-24?
Well, primarily with the B-24. I flew in the B-17. I never did in the B-29.
Any comparison between the 17 and the 24?
17 was probably a little warmer plane, but it didn't carry as big a bomb load.
Tell me about what you were assigned to wear on the B-24, and I would think that would be kind of interesting to learn. You mentioned that the plane was somewhat cold.
Well, anytime you get up to about 20,000 feet, it's down about zero. And you had heavy flying clothes and some electric flying suits. If you're lucky, they worked.
Some complaints that they didn't work.
Some of them didn't work.
They plugged into the electrical system of the plane.
Yes.
Whereabouts did you, as the navigator, sit in the plane? Was that right behind the pilot, or?
No, that was up in the nose, right behind the nose turret.
Could you see out of the plane from where you sat?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I always went back with the pilot thrown back in the waist for landing. You never stayed up there for landing.
Oh, is that right? Let me ask you this, Guy. What was your military unit, or what? I know in the Army it's divisions, but what were you assigned to? What wing group or the name?
Well, when we went to Europe, it was in the 8th Air Force, 467th Bomb Squadron. Let's see. I forget which group it was now. But we was over there. We were stationed at Rackheath, England.
Rackheath. Do you remember how that was spelled by any chance?
R-A-C-K-H-E-A-T-H, I believe.
Rackheath, England. In addition, with your responsibilities as navigator on the B-24, tell me this: were you assigned any other duties?
No, I didn't have any gun or anything like that.
Okay. And were there any transfers to other units at this time, or did you stay with the group you were assigned to?
Well, just our when we finished training in California, the crews split up. We just traveled as individual crews. I mean, our whole crew went together, but and I think there was one other crew that went to the same base, but the whole group didn't go. together.
With the group that you flew with, was there very many interaction with other groups from other planes? Did you basically your group stay together and?
You mean socialize together?
Yeah, that type of.
Oh, we mixed with other crews a lot, yeah.
You mentioned going to Europe, and I asked you what you did after your basic training, and you went to these schools in California. I guess before we go to Europe, tell me about the things you did on the West Coast. What type of training did you do? And I think I heard you say earlier you flew up and down the coast. And what kind of things did you do?
Well, we done a lot of practice bombing.
Oh, okay.
And
frightening the civilians.
no, this was out in the desert far
Oh.
enough away that you wasn't close to anybody. And some gunnery practice, some navigation flights. And as I said before, the pilot had some formation flying for the pilots to get onto that before we went over.
About how often would you fly?
Let's see, I believe it was 2 and 3 times a week.
Is that right? Do you remember any specifics of, like, say, how many gas or how much gas it would take for the plane, and some of the things you'd have to do to prepare to get the plane off the ground?
The plane usually burned around 240 to 50 gallon an hour. Of course, that was the crew chief's responsibility to see that everything was filled and everything checked over before we even got out of the plane. And I usually checked my compass and the navigation equipment to see that it was okay before we took off.
Did you ever have an instance in the plane when you were flying when your equipment didn't work?
Oh, at times I'd have about trouble. Jim would have trouble with the bomb sight, and most of the time he'd get it to work. Once, and I think a couple of times we had to just abort the bombs, and he never did get it to working right.
Usually planes have a ground crew that maintains the planes. Was this a group that you came in a lot of contact with, or was it kind of a separate?
Well, personally, I didn't know. I didn't come in contact with them. And like I say, our crew chief would always check the plane over before we took off. And if he said we didn't think we'd go for some reason, we didn't go.
So he would have the last word on if the plane was flyable and there were.
Well, I don't know for sure whether he had the last word or the pilot did, but the pilot had enough faith in him that he wouldn't go against him much.
Do you remember what had to be done in order to keep that plane flyable and things you had to maintain quite a bit?
Well, of course, if there's anything wrong, the crew chief wrote it up when we come down and turned it over to the ground crew for them to get in shape for the next flight. Because it'd be some other crew fly that plane again before we did.
Oh, is that right? So you weren't assigned to one specific plane?
No.
Oh, is that right? Huh. Let's look now at overseas, and when did you finally leave the United States, and where were you sent, and when did you go?
In April '45, we went to England. And I remember we was aboard ship when the word of Roosevelt's death came through. That was in April '45.
Oh, is that right? What was the reaction to those around you at the death of Roosevelt?
I think most of them figured that it wouldn't make too much difference because they knew he'd been in poor health for some time and things were pretty well took care of.
Where did you leave the United States, and do you remember what kind of ship you went over on?
We left from Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, went over to New York Harbor. The name of the ship was Isle de France. Before the war, it had been a pleasure cruise ship.
Oh, is that right?
It was a pretty nice ship. But it was the first trip that it had made by itself. Before it always went in convoy.
All right. So then there was a pretty good sense that there wasn't a big need to travel in convoys at that point.
Right. The Germany was getting far enough along and they'd been sinking enough subs that they didn't think the danger was too bad for a fast moving ship.
What were your quarters like in the ship going over?
Crowded, but pretty good.
Did you travel with Army Air Corps or infantry units, or do you remember?
No, I think it was all Air Corps.
And where did you arrive in England?
I'm not sure. It was on the West Coast.
Okay. Once you arrived, and did you go immediately to Rackheath, England?
Yes.
Yeah. And what were you assigned to do once you arrived there?
Well, we had about a week ground school classes telling us what to expect. And I was lucky we didn't, our crew never flew any combat, so I reckon I was lucky. They flew 2 or 3 missions after we joined the base, and I always figured if they would have flew one more mission, we would have been on it. That's how close we were.
Is that right?
But like I said, the first week or 10 days, you always got so much ground school and training and classes on what to expect and one thing and another.
Well, tell me this, while you were in England, of course there were English people over there, and probably a number of them who had either lived through the Blitz and the attacks by Germany earlier in the war. Did you ever have any opportunity to talk with any of them about that?
Yeah, we talked to different people in town, and
Do you remember any stories that
we
people
got
shared?
I think we did get a 3-day pass over there and went down to London after the war was over. And we went around to an organization that would furnish you a guide. And we don't know what was up in his 60s, but I think he knew the history of every building in London, and he made an interesting day for us.
Did he really?
He had 4 of us with him, and he could tell you the history, I think, of every building in London. Of course, he didn't think they amounted too much if they wasn't 900 or 1000 years old. But he'd tell you what year it was built, who the architect was, who the builder was, and really made an interesting day out of it. And he showed us some of the nicer building in London. And he had been connected to one of the bigger insurance companies over there. And he had also been in the military when he was younger for some time. And we got kind of tickled at him for the day it was over. He smoked a pipe. By the time we get that old pipe out and get her fired up, one of us would pull out a pack of cigarettes and say, "Here, you careful of cigarettes, mister?" "Yes, I believe I will. I like those American cigarettes." And he'd grab that old pipe and just shove it down in his pocket.
I hear a lot of stories about Europeans really appreciated American cigarettes.
Yeah.
Were there many, when you say you were in London, did you see much damage that had been done by German bombs?
Yeah, you could see a lot of it. You didn't have to walk very far.
Is that right? Tell me this, from the time in which you started your training to the time that you arrived in Europe and you were preparing, your crew was preparing, did your mental attitude change at all, or did your thought process change? Did you have any recollection of that?
No, not particularly. I don't think I ever worried much about whether they're going to make it back or not. I just always took it that we're going to come back, and there's some bad times, but if you look for them, there's always something to laugh about.
Yeah. I understand that's it's a common thing that holds a lot of your soldiers. You become kind of family members with the rest that you serve with, and the good times always kind of outweigh the kind of the miserable circumstance in which you're going through.
It's better off if you keep it that way.
Did you write many letters home?
I usually tried to write once a week.
And did you receive many letters and or packages?
Yeah, Mother always wrote at least once a week. Once in a great while, Dad did write. He didn't write very many letters, but Mother had 4 sons, or they had 4 sons in service, so she wrote a lot of letters in her time.
Yes, she would.
In that 3 or 4 years.
What types of things did you receive in packages from home? Do you remember?
Oh, she used to send us some cookies and once in a while. That's what always tasted good.
Well, that you mentioned tasted good. Let's talk about military food. Do you remember the types of things that they served you when you were stationed in Europe and maybe in California? And what was it like? And what was your attitude about it?
Most places we had pretty good food. A lot of it depended on what kind of cooks you had. I think when I was in the infantry, each company had their own mess hall. And our company commander would keep check on it. And if that cook brought out a bunch of stuff that wasn't good, he was on the cook, he wanted to know why.
Exactly.
And so I think our company ate better than a lot of the companies right next to us that got the same supplies, but we just had a better cook and a company commander that seen that he put out pretty decent food or he was in trouble.
When you mentioned your company in infantry training, did you have any idea of what division you would be training for, or was it just general infantry training and then they'd assign you later?
They trained us as a division and all went over together as a division.
Do you know what division that was?
103rd.
103rd. And do you know what 103rd Division, do you know what army that was assigned to by any chance, and where they ended up at?
They went to Europe and through Germany. I don't know which army over there.
I mentioned earlier a little bit about the letters you received home. Well, did you forge close bonds of friendship with many or some of the men you served with?
Well, our crew got pretty close, and we probably went 15 or 20 years and never got together. And then one of the boys tried to get us all together, but by that time both pilots were dead. I had seen Bill Buck, first pilot, 2 or 3 times. He was up here in Illinois, and he died with cancer. And then we got a letter from the co-pilot's wife that he died from a heart attack, and he wouldn't have been over 40, I'm sure.
So do you remember how old your pilot was? Like, say, during the war, his approximate age?
Well, he was on the crew. He was probably 25. And I think he was the oldest one.
To be a pilot, he had to be an officer, is that right?
Right.
Was there some college training that he had been, or was he a college graduate?
Yeah. A good deal of, well, no, I don't think he was a college graduate, no. But a good deal of their training was the same as mine, except for the final phase. He went and specialized as a pilot, and I went for navigation school.
How close do you think you were to maybe pursuing officer's rank?
Well, of course, I had a commission when I graduated from the navigation school. I had a second lieutenant's commission.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that.
And I considered a little about staying in, but not too strong. I don't know whether I could have even or not, because there were a lot of flight officers, and I'm sure that they wouldn't want to keep everybody in. Whether I could have stayed or not, I'm not even positive.
A question I have is, during any of your training experience, whether it was here in the States or over in England, did you have any opportunity to interact with German POWs?
Some of the bases here in the States, they had German POWs, yeah.
Tell me about
After coming back from England, we flew back, and the reason I got to come back so quick was they intended to retrain us or give us a little training and send us on to Japan. And then after we got back here, the way things started going in Japan, they dropped the atom bomb. Why they soon seen there wasn't going to be any need of it, so I never went.
Tell me a little bit about your about maybe either conversations or some of the stories about these German POWs here in the States.
Well, what little I seen of them, they was pretty compatible. Of course, they were smart enough to know it was the easiest thing to get along. And I remember a story one told. He said his father or his uncle one told him before he ever went in the army. He said, now eventually Germany will lose the war. He said, they're going strong now. But he said, they will eventually lose. And he said, when you get in, pull anything you can to keep from going through the Russian front. He said, the first chance, if you ever get a chance to surrender to the United States Army, do that and you'll live the rest of the war better than any place else.
Probably came to true by those words.
So I don't know whether he done it intentionally or whether his whole group got, but anyhow, I think he was glad to surrender to the United States.
Where were these troops at, these POWs, at the time that you saw them?
Well, these were at Pio, Texas. Pio, Texas. That's where I was at just before I got discharged.
Well, tell us about how you and the other men you served with, what you did to celebrate America's traditional family holidays, such as Thanksgiving and Christmas.
Well, sometimes you would, if you're in the right place, you might be invited. They always served a good meal on base where you've had turkey and all the trimmings on Christmas or Thanksgiving.
You know, you're away from home and you're away from your family at this time, and you mentioned earlier that you had 3 brothers who were also serving. What branches of the service were they in?
Brother Bill was in the ground forces, and Carl and Gene were in the Navy.
Did you have any opportunity when you were all 3 serving in the military to write to one another? Did you hear from them, or did you have to hear from them via your parents?
No, we'd write each other every once in a while. We always had their address. I seen my brother Bill in California, and I think he was the only one that would come back home.
When and how did you return to the United States after the end of the war?
We brought a plane back. We flew back.
How long did that take?
Well, we left England, went to Ireland, down to the Azores. Left the Azores one night, got out about 3 hours and had engine trouble.
Over the Atlantic Ocean.
Over the Atlantic.
Tell me about that. And I want to know, what was your thoughts going through your time having trouble over the Atlantic Ocean?
Well, it took the pilot a while to decide whether to go back or go ahead, and I think with the crew chief's urging, they decided to go back. And I think we was very lucky we did, because we lost one engine, blew the cylinder, so we had to feather it. And by the time we got back, there was nothing in bad shape. In fact, the crew chief said we were lucky to make it back at all.
Were you frightened?
No, not till we got down.
I guess ignorance is kind of bliss, huh?
Yeah.
What you don't know doesn't bother. Well, so you went back to the Azores?
Yes,
Is that right?
and then we were there for, I think, about 3 days while they overhauled the engines. And
How did you feel about
Very
crawling
good.
back into the plane?
oh, it didn't worry me at that time.
Well, what happened when you arrived back in the United States?
Well, we went from there to Gander, Newfoundland, and down to Connecticut, where we left our plane. And then I was sent by train to Camp Grant and given a 30-day leave.
And this was, what was the approximate date this time?
That was the last of June or July.
Of 1945.
45.
Tell me about your military rank and any decorations you received while you were in the military.
Well, I was second lieutenant. I don't know if I had any medals. I reckon I had an expert with a rifle. And I don't know if I had any other decorations.
Did you retain any of your military paraphernalia, memorabilia that you had?
I probably still got a uniform hanging down in the basement if it.
Upon your return to civilian life, we're going to get to that in a few minutes, but how did you get along with the men with whom you had the greatest contact with?
Well, we always got along good.
Were there things you would do differently if you could do them once again?
No, I don't know if I'd changed too much, Dan.
How much thought, you mentioned a little bit that you'd given it some thought about staying in the military. Some guys did, some guys didn't, of course, but at that time, 1945, I think that we were trying to get out of a military posture and try to get everyone back into society.
Yeah.
What prompted you to consider staying in the military?
I don't know if I considered it very strong, because I was always kind of a home town boy and country boy, and didn't really think I wanted to take up a life like that for 20 years or better.
Were there any times when you were serving that you were homesick?
No, I don't think I ever did really get homesick. Because I'd been away from home quite a bit before I went in.
Is there any one thing that stands out as your most successful achievement during your military service?
Well, no. I did think it done fairly good going through cadets and graduating, because you was bucking a lot of men that had at least partial college education, where I hadn't had. And when I first got in, I didn't know whether I could make it through something like that or not. And they did throw a lot of stuff at you fast. But about like everything else, you set your mind to it, but you can usually do it.
How did you learn about VE Day, and what was your reaction to it?
Well, of course, I was in Europe at the time, there's a lot of celebrating going on in town.
You remember anything specific about memories about the celebrating that was going on?
No, not too much.
Well, how did you learn about VJ Day, and what was your reaction to it then?
I think I was in Nebraska when that happened, and if I remember right, they restricted the base. They didn't want us to go to town, take it apart.
What was your opinion at the use of the atomic bomb when it was used against Japan in 1945?
Well, I think it saved a lot of American lives.
Possible invasion.
Yeah, and made it, I think it ended the war a lot quicker.
Has your opinion changed over the last 50 years, and if so, how?
You mean about the atomic bomb?
Yeah.
No. I still think if they had it was a good thing to use. Now, I think in time it may cause trouble. I don't know how good the invention was, but after they had it, well, I think it was a good thing to use it.
When and where were you officially discharged from the service?
From Pio, Texas, about the 1st of December, 45.
And what did you do upon getting out? Did you come home right away?
Yeah. Well, I'm sure they give us a train ticket home.
Do you have any contact with the Veterans Administration?
No.
Do you have any opinions of the VA, and have you ever needed to use any of their medical services?
I've never used any medical services. I think the ones that was wounded in service deserves all the treatment they can get.
I guess that I want to get into the final question. This is a two-part, so bear with me. Would you like to tell me about how your family supported you while you were in the military, and then over the years, what has this support meant to you?
Like I say, Mother always wrote letters. Real regular. They always acted glad to see you if you come home. Hate to see you go. Maybe being the last one in, I think it took Mother a while to get over that. And well, family love's always a hard thing to beat, Dan.
Again, we mentioned earlier that you were in the service on 3 brothers. Was there any thought about, remember the Sullivan Act that they had during the war with the brothers who were all serving? I think they were all serving on one ship at that time, and it was sunk and they all went down. Was there any thought about that, about the 4 boys of the family all being in service at the same time?
Oh, I suppose some, and I'm sure my mother thought about it a lot. Or probably both of folks. Dad was a quiet man, so he never voiced much. But he done a lot of thinking.
Well, how did your experiences during World War II affect your life since that time?
Well, I probably got a lot of traveling. I was lucky enough to get a good deal of education out of going through cadets. And you seen a lot about how different parts of the country, how the people lived, and even part of England. Just how it affects you is kind of hard to say.
Well, do you feel your wartime contribution to the nation has been appreciated?
But the biggest part of the people, I think it has.
Well, thank you, Guy, for cooperating with this project. I appreciate your time and sitting down with me and answering these questions.
Gene helped Dad put his crop out that year. And I knowed about time for me to go on the draft. You pretty well knew where you stood. And so we went over and asked him for I believe it was 60-day deferment for me to help Dad get his crop out. And I thought with three brothers being in and one of them helping him put it out that I wasn't asking for anything out of line.
Right.
And they turned us down. Dad was talking to the lawyer here in town. He says, "Why don't you appeal it?" He says, "They'll probably turn it down," but he says it takes about 60 days to go up the state and back. So we turned in an appeal. That's what happened. They turned it down, but it took about 60 days for us to hear, so I helped him get his corn crop out.
Well, how many acres did your dad farm at that time?
Oh, if I remember right, I think he had about 60 acres of corn, but he shucked them by hand.
It's a lot of work.
And nowadays that don't seem like much, but if you're going to start in shucking by hand, well, it's quite a bit.
Yeah. Did your dad have anyone work for him on the farm, or was it just
No.
you and the boys?
Just him, Gene.
Your two brothers had joined the Navy. What led to their choice to join there? We're talking right here in the middle of the United States. We really don't have much water around us. But,
Oh, I think maybe they thought it might be a better life or a cleaner life than the Army. And of course, a good part of the time when you went in the Army, you ended up in the ground force, infantry or something like that. So I think they just thought they'd try the Navy.
your dad's farm, about 60 acres. Did he have very much machinery to go along with it, or?
Well, I don't remember for sure whether he had a tractor yet then or not. But anyhow, he didn't have a corn picker. And, well, he wasn't no big farmer, no. But, and I say I think he had about 60 acres of corn. Of course, then he had some wheat and a few cattle and some pasture and cut hay.
Were there any hog farmers at that time in Illinois?
Well, at that time, everybody had a few hogs.
Right.
Practically every farmer had a few hogs, a few cattle, and chickens. And milk and eggs what brought in your grocery money.
You remember any ideas about how much your dad made at that time off the farm?
No, not too much, because back in them days you didn't have to file income tax.
You just basically lived as far as you could. And
Yeah.
it was,
But you didn't handle very much money, so you couldn't make very much.
right.
And
It's kind of fascinating because life sure has changed over the way people farm, and operations are so specialized now and so large. It's completely different.
probably in some ways my generation has seen as much change as any generation ever seen.
Yeah. You're talking about when you were younger. You said you used to have a wagon. That was a functional part of the farm.
All right.
And today we've got people with telephones in their cars.
Yeah. And when you went down through the country, very few houses had a bathroom. It was all outhouses and a wash tub.
What was your first job after you got out of the military?
No. I started helping a carpenter named Clarence Tingley.
relation, or?
Him and Dad were first cousins. And I worked with him a couple of years and then went to working with or for Johnny Snyder.
When did you go through the trade program and become a union carpenter?
Well, as far as trade program, I never went through any. I just joined as a carpenter.
So there wasn't a period of...
Well, I had enough experience by the time I joined again. Back at that time, really, they didn't have much of an apprentice program either. And most veterans, if you knowed anything at all, they'd let you join as a carpenter. I guess I did join the union and worked some not too long after I got out, but I worked around Marshall most of the time for several years.
What was Marshall like in 1946, 47 upon your return? How big a town was it?
Well, I expect it was close to the same size it is now. But you had all your grocery stores. There was 3 or 4 grocery stores on Main Street, a couple of drug stores, a couple of hardware stores, 2 lumber yards in town.
So you had a variety.
Yeah.
How often would you, geographically we're 15 miles from Terre Haute, Indiana. How often would you go to Terre Haute?
Well, now you talking about after the war?
Yeah, well, before and after the war.
Well, after the war, when I got my own car, well, it might have not been very long apart.
Yeah. Is that your first car? After the
Yes.
war?
When I was a small kid, they wouldn't go to Terre Haute once or twice a year.
Major trip.
Yeah.
How'd you get there?
Well, with a car.
Yeah. Did your folks have one, or did you have to?
Yeah. Yeah, they've had a car since I can't remember when I didn't have a car.
Do you know what kind it was?
I think the first one was a Model T, and then a 23 Dodge Touring.
Something I failed to ask you, which I've asked some of the other guys. When you were in the military service, did you go to church that often?
I won't say I went every Sunday. I went quite a bit.
Were there a number of places for you to worship? And you grew up, what was the denomination you grew up in?
Well, it was evangelical first. Well, I guess when I was a real little kid, we went to First Church in Marshall, and then we started going to Zion Evangelical. And it went with the United Brethren, and then they went with the Methodist, so it's back to Methodist now. But down on the bases, they always had chapel or church with services every Sunday morning.
Did every base have their own chaplain?
Yes.
You're coming from a small town,
Any side base, or any base I was ever at, had your Protestant and your Catholic both.
Did you ever have any much contact with, like, say, those of different faiths? Of course, Catholics and Protestants, but like, say, any Jews or anything like that was maybe kind of different or what you were used to?
Oh, yeah, there was a few Jews. Yeah, I'd say their way was a little different.
Was there any ever conversation about maybe what was going over in Europe at that time with the concentration camps and persecution of the Jews by the Germans?
I don't remember very much specifically, no.
Were you aware of this, or did you know, or had you heard about it?
Oh, yeah. Of course, in the military, I don't know if you kept up on the news as good as when you was home.
Well, that wraps up our conversation, Guy. Once again, thank you.
Okay.